It's true that very few of us here at Team TripleJump lived through 1990, and even fewer of us can remember it even if we did, but that doesn't mean that we can't be appreciative of all the video games that the year gave us, okay? The power couple that was Konami and Hideo Kojima gave the world Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, Nintendo released Super Mario World, and point-and-click fans got to bask in everything that the Secret of Monkey Island had to offer. You know us though, we don't like to remember the past fondly. No, we'd much rather dwell upon the shoddiest titles that yesteryear had to offer, and so we're back to highlight the 10 most horrible games of one particular 12-month period. For today's worst games of list, we've dredged up the crappiest titles from the year 1990. As ever, a game must have been released in at least one territory in that year and must have received a minimum of 7 professional reviews, okay? I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst games of 1990. Number 10. Balloon Kid. Game Boy, 66.67%. It seems that 1990 couldn't have been too terrible of a year for gaming, as the title in our number 10 spot wasn't actually awful. It wasn't a great game by any stretch, but Balloon Kid could have been much worse. Balloon Kid follows the exploits of Alice and her younger brother Jim, a duo who just love to play with balloons. One day, Jim gets the clever idea to tie all of his balloons together, though it all goes a bit Pete Tong when a particularly strong wind carries him into the sky, leaving Alice to rescue the little lad. Now, I'm not saying that Jim's fate is deserved, but balloons are terrible for the environment, so maybe think on Balloon Kid as a cautionary tale, eh, children? Critics didn't hate Balloon Kid, in fact some had praise for its gameplay, which they felt was improved over its predecessor, Balloon Fight, and for the initial bit of fun they had whilst playing it. They did point out though that the game was a bit on the easy side and got repetitive after a while. Still, if you'd got kiddos that were in desperate need of some entertainment, they'd have probably had a nice afternoon with Balloon Kid. Number 9. Revenge of the Gator. Game Boy, 60.83%. A game with a title like Revenge of the Gator conjures up images of a town beset by an angry reptile and a plucky bayou-dwelling hero. Sadly, the game I just described doesn't exist, at least not to my knowledge, and Revenge of the Gator is in fact an alligator-themed pinball game. I know, I'm as disappointed as you are. I probably don't need to explain how pinball works, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, here goes. Players begin the game by launching the ball, which then whizzes into the machine and bops around the obstacles a bit before falling towards the flippers. Points are accrued for keeping the ball in play, and the ultimate goal is to rack up a high score. Revenge of the Gator did all of this, but with alligators. Big fun. Critics didn't hate the game, but they couldn't find much to love either. At the end of the day, Revenge of the Gator was pinball, which is usually quite good fun in and of itself, but didn't have much else to offer. Revenge of the Gator was originally released in Japan in 1989, but didn't take the long swim to North America and Europe until 1990. We do sort of wish it had drowned en route though. Number 8. Insector X. Genesis, 59.17%. We did check, and no, that isn't a typo. The game really is called Insector X, which is a shame because we were expecting some sort of mashup between Inspector Gadget and the X-Men. Insector X places players into the teeny tiny shoes of Kai, a warrior who is on a mission to take on the cyborg insect army and free the insect world from the rule of the Dark Queen. The game was your standard side-scrolling shooter fare and didn't really bring anything fresh to the genre. On the whole, Insector X wasn't awful. Critics praised it for being technically sound, noting that the controls worked nicely and the hit detection was decent. The problem was that it just wasn't a particularly noteworthy offering. The graphics were fine, but a bit dull, the music was okay, and the game worked as it should have, though some found it to be a little on the easy side. Put simply, Insector X had all of the ingredients for a good game, bar one: excitement, and at a time where gamers ended up with more side-scrolling shooters than they did hot dinners, this was perhaps the worst thing the developers could have forgotten. Number 7. Double Dragon. Game Boy, 56.5%. Double Dragon? I'm surprised to see you here. Still, we welcome all shoddy games regardless of their reputation, so come on in. Double Dragon was originally released in arcades in 1987, but didn't make its way to the Game Boy until 1990. The story remained the same for the handheld port. Marion, girlfriend of protagonist Billy, has been kidnapped by a savage street gang known as the Black Warriors, and it's up to Billy to rescue her before it's too late. When it came down to it, the Game Boy version of Double Dragon wasn't the most egregious game ever to be unleashed upon the world, but it did have its problems. For one, the lower screen resolution of the Game Boy console meant that a lot of the game's details were lost, and whilst that lack of colour was wasn't detrimental, the obscured field of view certainly was. Players also found that the pace of the game was slowed in comparison to Double Dragon's arcade and home console counterparts. This was done on purpose in order to overcome the visibility problems, but it ended up making for a sluggish gameplay experience, which isn't what you want when trying to mash your way through a never-ending stream of goons. I want my goons mashed quickly, gosh darn it! Number 6. Columns. Genesis. 56.3%. This isn't the first time we've seen a Columns title on one of these lists, and it would seem that when it comes to being mediocre, the Columns 3 apple doesn't fall far from the Columns tree. Columns gameplay was fairly straightforward. Stacks of gems would fall from the top of the screen, a la Tetris, and the players simply needed to rearrange the gems before finding a place in the play area to put them all. Mash 3 gems, and they disappear. If the game were released today, it would probably be some obnoxious mobile title with a ton of ads and microtransactions. Again, the game wasn't completely terrible. It looked nice enough, it controlled well, and its gameplay was reasonably simple to understand. If you were the sort of person that enjoyed Tetris, then you might have gotten a kick out of Columns, but it's unlikely that you'd have felt that the game stacked up, pun very much intended, to its inspiration's greatness. If Columns was the only puzzle game that you had access to, then it was perfectly serviceable for passing a few minutes. Otherwise, you'd have been far better off trying to get your hands on literally any version of Tetris over this pale imitation, even the graphics calculator one. Number 5. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Genesis. 54.2%. We've seen some bizarre games in our time here at TripleJump, but there are a few that measure up to the concept behind Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. There were actually several games developed and released under the same title, and although they were all kind of naff, it was the Sega Genesis version that took the brunt of the criticism. Moonwalker is based on the movie of the same name, specifically the segment Smooth Criminal, in which Michael sets out to find a bunch of kidnapped children. Players control Jackson, who must make his way through multiple levels, rescuing kids and fighting a load of goons sent by the game's antagonist, Mr. Big. The game did have a certain weird charm to it, but that soon wore off when players realized that the same beats were being repeated for the entirety of its runtime. Using Jackson's dance moves to defeat enemies was fun for a couple of minutes, but it was all that game had to offer, really. Hardcore fans would have absolutely had a hoot listening to the MIDI versions of Jackson's popular tunes, including the likes of Smooth Criminal and Billie Jean, but for everyone else the game was an exercise in vanity, and a banal one at that. Number 4. Dynamite Duke. Genesis. 50.62%. We've got to hand it to Dynamite Duke. That box art was certainly a choice, wasn't it? The slightly unnerving cover should have been the first tip-off to gamers that Dynamite Duke wasn't a particularly good game. The Duke started out life in arcades in 1989 before making his way onto home consoles a short time later. Players take on the role of the Duke as he and his cybernetic arm attempt to thwart the plans of an evil scientist who has used a secret formula to create an army of mutant warriors. Though its premise made for a few fun minutes in the arcade, it didn't really translate well to home consoles. For one, there was only about 30 minutes of action to be had, and considering the fact that Dynamite Duke retailed for a whopping $34.99 at the time, which adjusted for inflation is now the best part of 70 quid or the cost of a PS5 exclusive, this didn't translate to good value for money. The game was also severely lacking in the challenge department, which upset more experienced players, and it had some pretty janky controls to boot. Oh well, at least players only had to wait another year for the real Duke. Number 3. The Final Fantasy Legend. Game Boy. 48.5%. Hold on, this can't be right. Let me just... Hello? Writer, you've accidentally gotten some Final Fantasy in one of our worst games of list. What do you mean, stop calling you with this faux outrage for the sake of a joke? Alright, there's no need to be like that. Although the Final Fantasy series has been renowned over the years for its quality, that doesn't mean it's immune from the odd misstep. Technically, the Final Fantasy Legend wasn't really a Final Fantasy game, as it was released in Japan as the first title in the Saga series. However, when it was translated into English, Square decided to slap the Final Fantasy branding on it in order to shift more copies. Very sneaky. Whether you call it Makai Toshi Saga or the Final Fantasy Legend though, the game wasn't all that great. Though some outlets praised the story and the RPG elements of the game, others simply couldn't look past the difficulty, with the game often proving to be challenging to the point of frustration, even for fans of the genre. Hardcore RPG fans might have been able to deal with it, but for most, the Final Fantasy Legend was just too tough to be enjoyable. Number 2. Atomic Robo Kid. Genesis. 38.75%. I wonder who'd win in a fight, Balloon Kid or Atomic Robo Kid? In a standard punch-up, my money would be on the Robo Kid, but if it was a battle of the review scores, Balloon Kid not only beats Atomic Robo Kid, but she thoroughly embarrasses him. Set in the distant future of the 21st century, Atomic Robo Kid follows the eponymous robotic child as he embarks on a quest to defeat the alien governors who are hell-bent on destroying all sentient life. It was the fairly classic tale of humanity's last stand against extraterrestrials who wish to wipe them from the face of whichever planet they're inhabiting. Atomic Robo Kid was guilty of a lot of bad game sins. The weapons, enemies, stories, and setting were all pretty uninspired, the graphics were lackluster, the sound was poor, and the game suffered from numerous bugs. Even when the game was working as intended though, there wasn't much fun to be had from the gameplay. Robo Kid himself was clunky and lethargic and was only really of any use once he'd found a speed power-up. The levels were repetitive, and the collision detection was very hit and miss. Once again, pun very much intended, you're welcome. Considering the fact that there were a number of far more successful space-themed shooters out there at the time, there was absolutely no reason to play this atomic shambles. Number 1. Technocop, Genesis, 33.75%. Now, you know us. We're not exactly averse to a bit of the old ultra-violence. After all, how else are we going to keep James in line? But even we have to draw the line when it's all that a game has to offer. Technocop was part side-scrolling shooter, part driving game, where players took on the role of a cop in a futuristic city and were tasked with gunning down a number of thugs within a time limit. The main issue with Technocop was that graphic violence was its main selling point, and it seemed like the developers spent all of their time making enemies explode in grotesque fashion and didn't bother to put any thought into anything else. There wasn't really any plot to speak of. The on-foot missions were repetitive, and the driving segments were little more than an exercise in frustration, giving players no control over where they were going and instead just flinging enemies and obstacles at them, presumably just to see if they could survive. We can only assume that the team behind the game hoped that they could trick fans of Robocop into buying Technocop. If you were one of the many people duped into purchasing Technocop, then you have our deepest and sincerest sympathies.